Hello, and welcome everybody to the National Trends in Disability Employment,
or nTIDE,
Lunch and Learn series.
Just a few housekeeping items before we begin.
This webinar is being recorded.
We will post an archive of each webinar each month on our website at www.researchondisability.org/nTIDE.
This site will also provide copies of the presentations, the speakers' bios, full transcripts, and other valuable resources.
As an attendee of this webinar, you are a viewer.
To ask questions of the speakers, click on the Q&A box on your webinar screen and type your questions into the box.
Speakers will review these questions and provide answers during the last section of the webinar.
Some questions may be answered directly in the Q&A box.
If you have any questions following this recording, please contact us at disability.statistics@unh.edu
or toll free at 866-538-9521 for more information.
Thanks for joining us.
Enjoy today's webinar.
Good morning, everyone, or good day, as the case may be. Next slide, Megan. Welcome. This is the nTIDE Lunch and Learn. It's a joint effort between the University of New Hampshire, the Association for University Centers on Disability, and the Kessler Foundation. This event occurs at noon Eastern Time on the first Friday of each month, and with the release of our nTIDE report, our National Trends in Disability Employment. This project is a part of the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Employment Policy and Measurement and is funded by NIDE. Next slide, please. We're going to have four parts to our webinar today. Part one will be a review of the numbers.
John, we're not hearing you in case you can hear us.
Okay, it looks like John's mic is going out. I'll just take over for him for right now. I think that his audio has gone out as well because he cannot hear us. But our overview for today, I'll bring my video up here. We're going to have a couple of guest speakers today to provide some context to some ongoing trends. But before we do that, I just wanted to go over what the nTIDE report is. So we have a basic, every month we have a jobs report that we provide a press release that gives us some updated employment statistics that let us know how the employment situation is doing for people with disabilities compared to people without disabilities. This is to complement the jobs report that the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out each month on the first Friday. So some notes about that: the data come from the current population survey, which is the official source of employment data. You'll see that reported widely in the press. It includes all civilians ages 16 to 64 who are not living in institutions. And we have reliable data going from September 2008 forward, where we can compare people with and without disabilities. Just a note that these numbers are not seasonally adjusted, which is why we compare each monthly number, we compare to the same month for the prior year. So I'm going to start by showing you the numbers for January of 2020, the most recent release, and we're going to compare those to January of 2019. So we do have some good news for our jobs numbers this month, and I'll start by displaying this bar graph that shows the employment to population ratio. Now this is the percentage of working age people who were employed in January of 2020. And we have the rate for people with disabilities on the left and people without disabilities on the right. We've also, as I mentioned, displayed the numbers from January of last year for a point of comparison. So one thing we want to point out is that compared to last year, there was a slight improvement for January of 2020 for people with disabilities. The employment to population ratio was 30.7% for last month, and that's 0.9 percentage points higher than this time last year, or an increase of 3%. We see a similar level of improvement for people without disabilities, so 74.4% were employed compared to 73.6% in January of 2019, and that's an increase of 1.1%. I'm displaying here a similar bar graph, this time showing the labor force participation rate. Now, as a reminder, labor force participation includes anyone working, but it also includes people who are looking for a job, so they're part of the labor force. People who are not actively looking for work are counted as not participating in the labor force in these numbers. So here we see that the representation of people with disabilities in the labor force is also slightly higher for January of 2020 compared to January of 2019. 33.6% of people with disabilities are in the labor force, and that's 0.6 percentage points higher than the year before, or an increase of 1%. People without disabilities also saw improvement in their labor force participation. The current numbers, 77.4% of people without disabilities, and that's a 0.7% increase from January of the year before. Now I just want to return to the employment to population ratio for a minute and show you some trend data. We noted that we keep track of these trends dating to 2008. Now that would be the first year that the current population survey measured disability the same way that they measure it today. So this will allow us to make comparisons over time. So what we see here is, 2008 also noteworthy. That's kind of, period of beginning of a recession. So by plotting the top number, which is people without disabilities, the bottom number in green is people with disabilities, we see how the recession and other economic changes have affected employment representation for people with and without disabilities. I also just have here a plotting of a line over top of it. This will allow us to see the smoothing effect that accounts for the slight month-to-month variation. So while we'll note that both groups experienced a job loss initially, you see that people without disabilities were returning to the workforce a bit sooner, and this upswing in employment took a little bit longer for people with disabilities. But for both groups, we see this leveling off in the employment to population ratio. The gap between those with and without disabilities in the last year or so has remained somewhat consistent, and we see that the gap is about 44 percentage points difference between those with and without disabilities. So that's where we stand with the numbers right now. I'm gonna turn it over to Denise Roselle at the Association of University Centers on Disabilities, and she will fill us in on all the great new news.
Cool.
Hi, this is John O'Neill. I'm back on. My phone went dead. So Denise, take it over.
Thank you. So next slide. As I'm sure anyone knows, or everyone knows, things have been a little busy here in Washington. So I don't have a lot of federal policy updates for you around disability-specific issues. A couple of things to note. The President's budget for FY 2021, so that's from October 1, 2020 through September 30, 2021, comes out on Monday. So we will have a lot more information about the President's budget at that point, and any of you who are involved in budget appropriations work should keep an eye on that. We'll wait and see what happens, and I'll have more reports for you next month. Skipping down to the last bullet, I don't know if I've announced on this call or if you've heard, the current Julie Hawker has been nominated to be the new head of ODEP, the Office of Disability Employment Programs. She is currently at ACL at the Administration on the Office of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. She will stay at that office at ACL until such time as she is confirmed by the Senate. But once she is confirmed by the Senate, she will move over to ODEP. So that's, for folks on this call, I thought that might be important to know. The other thing, excuse me, the other thing that's happened in the last week or so. The CMS has announced a new Medicaid block grant possibility under the waiver program. Obviously, this is not, well, it is pretty much directly tied to employment in some ways. What it does is allow states to apply for a block grant under the waiver portion of Medicaid for the working age adult population. And most of those folks have come into the Medicaid program through Medicaid expansion. We have some information, data, that shows that a fairly large number of those folks are people with disabilities. So I would urge you to keep an eye on this one. There's a lot of information, and I'll stick in the chat box a link to some of the AUCD information on this. It brings all of the typical problems of block grants, but it complicates them through the waiver process. So we have a lot of information, and most of the other disability groups in the DC, the national disability groups, as well as a lot of the national poverty groups and others, have information out on this, but you definitely should be aware of it. It has the potential to impact Medicaid in your state. Okay, next slide. These are a couple things around informed decision making. I think I talked some about this last month, and these two popped up, and I thought they were really interesting because the first one, and they're both from ThinkWork at ICI Boston. The first one is in partnership with the DD state agencies and employment journey focused on informed choice, in-depth look at informed choice, how to do that. And as I say, it's from the DD state agency organization, NADDDS. The second one, also from ThinkWork, is a response by members of SAVE, self-advocates, and Green Mountain self-advocates to the paper by NASDDS, DDDS, on informed choice and decision making. And so the two make a really interesting juxtaposition to each other. I really recommend them. I think they're really interesting, raise some interesting points, and it was a really nice, it's a nice juxtaposition to look at from the self-advocate point of view and from the DD agency point of view, and then, you know, how do those things play together? So I really would recommend that one. Next slide. The Mathematica has a new research brief out around pre-employment transition services, PREETs. This is the first year, as I'm sure folks on this call know, it's the first year of data reporting on PREETs, which is brand new under WIOA, that emphasis on employment by youth and young adult employment, pre-employment. And it gives a baseline. What's really important about this data is that it gives us a baseline of national delivery in the first year. It shows the agency variance. It shows, no surprise to anyone out there in the states, that different states are handling this differently, that different states are benefiting different students, that the effect on agencies is different. It's actually very different across states. And as someone who has been working both with Promise and with PREETs from other positions, other transition-related things, this was really interesting to see. And I'm sure we're going to be using this baseline data for a long time to come. So this is from our friend Todd Honeycutt and the folks at Mathematica. Next slide. There's another one. I'm not sure if I've talked about this on these calls before. ODEP has a really nice apprenticeship page up. And I'm not sure that any of this is brand new, which is most of the stuff that I tend to bring to you, but there's a lot of information on apprenticeships. I think we're going to be hearing more about apprenticeships in the president's budget that's coming out. We've certainly heard a lot about it in the last couple of budgets, and ODEP is doing a lot of work about it. And this is a really nice place to get a toolkit that talks about the basics and about how youth with disabilities fit into these programs or don't. And there's also a project that ODEP is doing with employers specifically, some big employers, 4 of them, specifically around this. So this is one I would look at if this is something that is going on in your community, for one thing, and how do people with disabilities and youth with disabilities opt in, or how can you help them opt into some of this? Okay, next slide. Data gap. This one is from the National Conference of State Legislatures, and it just popped up on my screen the other day. They have a whole section called out of their Work Matters report on disability employment, and they've been putting stuff up there. This is a brand new 2-pager on addressing the data gap in disability employment and looking at, how do we collect these issues? How do we gather it? And most states don't have good disability employment data. And what do we do about that? What are states doing? What are some interesting ways to look at that and say, like employment first, we talk about that. Some states have actually had separate data collection legislation for employment for people with disabilities. Thought that was interesting. So it's a nice outline of what states are doing in this world. And I highly recommend that you take a look at that. And it's another one of those pieces that you can use to take into your state and say, hey, we're not doing this. Here are some ideas that are coming from other states that we can look at. And what's interesting about it too is that it's coming from a state legislative organization. NCSL is the National Conference of State Legislatures themselves. So it's coming from them. That's important, and is likely to carry more weight. Okay, next slide. The previous slide referenced EARN, and so this was another place. One of the issues in that data gap has to do with self-reporting. And we all know what the issues are about self-reporting in employment on disability and all of the risks involved in that. And why people don't. I think most people on this call understand totally why people often don't. This takes an interesting, it's from EARN and the National Industries Liaison Group, EARN from ODEP grant. And it talks about some innovative approaches to address the barriers to self-identification. Lists some very specific strategies, give some examples. I just thought, particularly right on the heels of the NCSL Legis brief, I thought this was very interesting and a way of also talking about that data gap. Next slide. The disability employer diversity strategies. This is in JVR. There's a number of articles in the Journal of Vocational Rehabilitation in December. One of them is this one about diversity and corporate responsibility. But I've got a couple I'm going to talk about. They looked at 34 organizations who are nationally recognized for disability inclusion and tried to look at what are they doing that helps bring disability into that diversity world. Because again, as probably we all know, and I've just been having this conversation in the last few days with a corporation, a large corporation, about the fact that they brag a lot about diversity in their workplace, but they rarely brag about disability inclusion. So this is looking at folks who are doing it right and what they're doing and how they're doing it. And I thought this was an interesting one. Next slide. I think the next one is another one of those. Yeah, it's another one of those JVR articles in December. Go look at the whole issue. There were a bunch of really interesting things in here. This one's on poor physical health and the barrier of physical health for folks with serious mental illness in being employed. And the whole conclusion has to do with integrating the care of physical health and mental health so that can in turn improve employment participation. And for those of you who are doing this work, I'm not sure this is any surprise, but it's a nice place to have an article that says, this says what I know is true. Next slide. And again, from our friends at ODEP, but it's being administered by Mathematica. There's a new, it's called Youth Solutions. And they are looking for ways to improve employment and outcomes for youth 14 to 24 who are on SSI. And the way it works is you submit something to them, deadline by February 27th. And then if you're selected, you get a $20,000 stipend to develop the idea into a full paper that gets published and widely shared. I was asked to share this one. I think it's interesting. I think there's probably some interesting work going on out there. It's a way of getting something written. It's a small stipend, and I get that, but it's a way of sharing some interesting ideas, and they're really looking for innovation. So it's a way of pushing some innovation out. So February 27 deadline. Next slide. There's a webinar coming up. This one, you guys, this is all basic stuff that you will know. I guarantee it for those on the phone, the values of employment first. What is it? What are the principles? Why do you do it? It's the first of a series that APSE is doing on universal employment competencies. This one is the basic. And what I thought about it was for somebody who doesn't understand employment first, I'm guessing most of you on the phone, certainly those of you on the phone who are from employment first states will know this. But for those who aren't, this is a great intro. APSE is the organization that's tracking all of this nationally. And I think it would be a great intro for anybody who's trying to learn more about employment first. So that one's coming up on February 12th. That's just next week. Next slide, I think we're about done. Yeah. Just a plug, one more plug for the Disability Policy Seminar coming up March 23rd to 25th in Washington, D.C. It's a great time if you're a passionate advocate to come to Washington to talk about issues that are important to you. For folks on this call, I'm assuming that's competitive integrated employment, among other things. They need to hear a lot about that. So co-sponsor 7 of the national organizations, and registration is still open. So come join us. Next slide. And of course, one more plug. The Compendium releases next week. The annual Disability Statistics Compendium being released next week on Tuesday here in Washington, D.C. I will be there. I think a bunch of people on this call will be there. And I'm hoping the rest of you will be watching online or watching for the release. So that's really exciting too. Next slide. I think I'm tossing it back to you, John, right? You're doing the introduction.
Oh, okay. Thank you,
All
Denise.
yours.
That was all very interesting. And so I'd like to introduce our guest speakers today, Richard Petty, who's already been introduced, who will be facilitating an interview with Seth and Joe from the Lehigh Valley Center for Independent Living. They are engaged in some very innovative activities around transition and employment in their community. So Richard, I'll hand it off to you.
John, thank you very much. And Denise and John, thank you both. It's a great pleasure and honor for us to be here with you today. And for me, it's a special honor to introduce Seth Hodoreski and Joe Michener. They are leaders of very successful programs at Lehigh Valley Center for Independent Living in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Joe and Seth and the director of their center, Amy Beck, have worked for a number of years establishing and operating programs that have had significant successes in employing people with disabilities and readying people with disabilities for employment. Since some of you may not have experience with Centers for Independent Living, I'll in just a moment ask Joe and Seth to give you a description of Centers for Independent Living. But I would just like to highlight of one important piece of information is that ILRU, in its role as the operator of the ILNet National Technical Assistance and Training Center for Independent Living, operates a learning collaborative, and that learning collaborative is on youth transition in employment. And Joe and Seth have led one of these collaboratives very successfully for us, and are beginning another one on March 4th. And we have accepted applications for this collaborative, and we do hope to operate others in the future. This one will operate for several months, possibly as much as 12 months. And we're very much looking forward to that. But let's begin for today's presentation. We're going to share more information about their programs and their successes. But Seth and Joe, will you please begin with the description of a Center for Independent Living for our audience?
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, thank you, Richard. We definitely appreciate it. Thank you to everybody for making this all happen, for us being here today. We are thrilled about it. Thrilled to chat with you about our SIL and some of the stuff that we are doing. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, we just really wanted to start with what a SIL was, because or a Center for Independent Living is, because that really is a base for all of the work that we do. We do a ton of other work, but it really stems from those core principles of the independent living thinking and movement that really filter into all that we do. So a SIL, or a Center for Independent Living, is a nonprofit or cross-disability organization that works with any disability at any age. There's SILs all over the country. They might go by different names, We go by LBCIL, but other centers might go by different names that don't include that in there, and that's okay. They still follow the same principles and thinking as the other CILs do. And they were really born out of the civil rights movement of the late 60s. We tell people, Google Ed Roberts. We could probably do an entire webinar just about him and what he's done with the disability rights movement. But we tell people to check him out all the time with things. But for us as a center, for other CILs that are out there, it really boils down to those 4/5 core services that, again, is the root for all that is done. And they include information and referral. So if people are looking for any type of disability related information, they call us CIL and find that information out. Where do you go? How do you get a ramp put on your house? Where do you go for a particular program? The folks there should know that or be able to find that out. Peer support is another core service. Peer support is a person with a disability being there for another person with a disability. And that could be done in a variety of ways, through talking, through groups, but it really gives the opportunity for someone to relate to someone based on that level. And a very unique thing about a CIL or a Center for Independent Living is that at least 51% of the people that work at a CIL have a disability. Same goes for the board. So it gives that opportunity to relate on that level. And we see that being very powerful, especially for youth and young adults who are in transition that can see people with disabilities in the workforce. Helping with independent living skills is the next core service. So it's, if someone wants to learn to cook their favorite meal, balance their checkbook, that kind of thing, that could be helped. And that could be done individually, in groups, all that kind of thing. And then advocacy. Advocacy is another core service, and advocacy on a couple different levels. Individual advocacy, we do that all the time. We do a lot of housing advocacy and work with landlords. And it might be helping someone get Social Security. It really, anywhere where advocacy can be done, that's a CIL or CIL staff member can help with that. And then we get into advocacy on a systems level, working with local legislators, politicians to try to make things better and different for people with disabilities. Transition is the next one that we talk about. Transition not only from school to the adult world, like we're going to talk a little bit more about here today, but also, transition from nursing home to home, or really, we say when you look at it, all of life, there is some sort of transition. So, it really fits with those other core services. So again, those core services are worked on directly. The underlying theme for all of the other programs, and that is very unique about a CIL too, is they work on those core services, but then they usually do something very germane or unique to their area. So some CILs might do a particular thing, but they might not do another. And we just happen to do a whole bunch of other areas, including we do a lot with housing. We have a sign language interpretation referral service. We do a lot with accessibility in our community. And one of the main areas that really hit home here, so starting about 11 years ago, was we saw the real need for transition and employment here in the Lehigh Valley. So, we'll get more into all that kind of stuff, but wanted to really talk about that as the base for everything else that we're going to talk about.
And this is Joe. I would just add that at the foundation of everything we do, which came out through what Seth said, is consumer control and that IL philosophy. So that's just the background for everything we do here and our focus. And that can be a challenge at times when we're working with particular funders or certain other systems or whatever the case may be. But consumer control is what we fight for every day.
Well, thank you. That's good. And, in a center for independent living, consumer control, consumer direction is certainly on an individual level in receiving services, but it is, as Seth alluded to earlier, that it's at every level of the organization. The board of directors, the staff of the organization, a majority of those people are people with disabilities. There is a heightened awareness and a heightened interest in ensuring that consumer direction is throughout the fabric of the organization and throughout the work of the organization. And Seth and Joe, you operate two successful programs in employment. And let's take them one by one. Will you tell us about those programs?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Which one should we start with? The summer program? Is that that might be the best place to start. It kind of started with a grant that we received a number of years ago through our developmental disabilities program, where we started a program that was a year-round program called our S2L program, or our S2L group, which was a group of young adults that got together and did a number of different activities around employment, around advocacy, around communication, teamwork, all of that. But a big part of that was our summer program that we called the Real World Lehigh Valley. And we would typically host that on site at our center. And we did have young adults come each day over the summer and be able to interact with our staff and really learn a lot. That was something that over the years really grew, and eventually to the point where we were able to develop a relationship with Dorney Park and Wildwater Kingdom, which is an amusement park here in the Lehigh Valley. It's huge. They have just about everything there that you can think of. They are almost a mini city and do just about everything internally there. So we were able to build this relationship with them to the point where we were able to run that summer program, that Real World Lehigh Valley summer program, on site at Dorney Park. And in collaboration with Voc Rehab, VR, OVR. I know we call that different things in different parts of the country, but between us and that relationship we had with VR and Dorney Park, a few years ago we were able to start that program, and it was really cool because Dorney was right into it from the beginning. They really offered so much behind everything that we were looking to do, and they gave us opportunities to have space on site where we could be teaching the young adults that were part of the program curriculum on how to get a job, how to keep a job, self-advocacy skills, teamwork, communication, resume writing, how do you fill out applications, interviewing process. So there would be a big part of that throughout, each of the day. And then, they would work through the 6 weeks and eventually get an interview with Dorney HR staff. And it was really cool because some of the young adults actually received, employment, based off of that. So we were thrilled with that. So we had that whole component, which was curriculum based on site and working with, our staff in that regard. But then we were also able to get into the park to do work experiences and paid work experiences at that, where they would be able to try all kinds of different jobs there and, and really learn the background of what goes on at the park and get paid for it. So that was something that, that just happened. It was so good, such a great opportunity. And it just all kind of fit and fell together nicely for us, for OVR, for Dorney.
And the age range, excuse me, please, the age range of the youth you were working with in this program.
Yeah, that is, they're typically 16 to 21. It pretty much falls under the pre-employment transition services, that WIOA kind of funding that OVR has been supportive with. So it really fits nicely with all of that kind of thinking.
Great. And now that program, are you operating? Has that program expanded? Is it continuing as is in that one location, but other places?
Yeah, this is Joe. Maybe I'll take a step back quick. I mean, Seth, explained really nicely the Real World program, but we've been doing transition services for youth here at the SIL and employment services for more than a decade at this point. So we had a lot of small things going, like the S2L program. We had another program called Career Path, which was working with young adults who had just left high school and funded by Voc Rehab to support them in training for and finding and obtaining and keeping competitive integrated employment. So we were kind of a little bit ahead of the curve before the pre-employment transition services, or PREETS, was mandated through WIOA. So that put us in a good place to take advantage of that. And that's kind of one of the things that I wanted to talk about today, is that, earlier Megan was sharing a lot of the statistics for employment. So there's no question that we have a lot of work to do as far as improving those numbers for people with disabilities and employment. But there are improvements, I think, on a greater scale than there were 10, 11 years ago when Seth started the S2L program. With the initiation of pre-employment transition services, which again, fortunately, our SIL was kind of in line with and already had stuff up off the ground and going, has really created some great opportunities for students that weren't there, obviously, a decade before or 20 years before. And then, as Denise mentioned in previous slides, every state is doing this differently, and there's not a lot of data out there yet. But I can tell you from our level in Pennsylvania, what we're seeing is a lot of success through pre-employment transition services. So in addition to our Real World program, we're also doing more standard services through Voc Rehab that are offered statewide. And those include paid work experiences for young adults in addition to what they're doing in school. Job shadowing experiences. We're also getting to go in and do group presentations on self-advocacy, career skills, independent living skills. And these are invaluable experiences for the students. In some cases, we might be reinforcing some things that they're already doing in school, but what's added to it is not only do they have the great experience, but they get to start working with and getting connected to potential supports for after school. So, getting hooked up with vocational rehab at a much earlier age, or the county offices, or an adult service provider like us, a Center for Independent Living, and really helping that transition piece so that people aren't leaving school and kind of falling through the cracks and not getting connected to potential services that would benefit them. So there's just a host of things that are happening, and I think that are really exciting. We even now, at this point, it's about 4 or 5 years old, have a braided program, which is partially funded by the school districts and partially funded by Voc Rehab. It's called the Vocational Independence Program, VIP. And it follows a project search model, but it's working with students every day of their final year in school or second to last year of school. And they're doing paid work experiences. They're getting skills training on work essential skills and independent living skills. And they're also getting connected with all of these other services to really have a seamless transition from post-secondary education to from secondary education into adult life. Also, one of the things we do here at the SIL in almost all of our programs is person-centered planning. And we're not just talking a person-centered approach. That's important too. We do that all the time. But we're using more formal person-centered planning models to really help the young adults self-determine, self-advocate, and to really help them pursue the goals that they want to pursue. And I think pre-employment transition services has helped that, because we're able to work with students earlier and explore different jobs so that they can have a better idea of what their interests are and maybe have a career track started earlier that's more successful because they know it's what they want to do, instead of kind of floundering out there and trying to figure out what's going on. So Denise also mentioned in her slides that there's not a lot of stats out there on the results of pre-employment transition stuff, the Mathematica stuff. It's a lot of numbers about how the states are using it, but not a lot of outcomes. So, but I truly believe from what we're seeing here in Pennsylvania and what we hear across the country nationally from other SILs, that we're going to see those numbers changing for the positive as far as outcomes go.
And thank you for pointing out how person-centered planning operates within a consumer-directed environment. It's important, and there are often questions about that. So that's helpful. So when participants experience barriers, as you're working with them or before you've worked with them, or what are you identifying as you work with the participants in your program about the employment barriers and the readiness barriers that they experience?
A lot of those traditional barriers that I think have been around for a long time, whether it be housing or transportation, you know, those big ones that are an issue all across the country. But we're also seeing, again, just having chances to explore can not having them can be a huge barrier. We have so many young adults we work with that through pre-employment transition services, we get a chance to go out and explore things with them. And you know, I mean, not to simplify it, but we sometimes have a student come to us and say, I want to be a nurse. And why do you want to be a nurse? Well, you know, my aunt's a nurse. I really look up to her. I think I'd like it too. We go explore that situation or that type of job. And then they go, oh, wait, I really don't want this. And to have those opportunities before you graduate, I think is really key. It's when students don't have those opportunities that I think really compounds the other traditional barriers that we're trying to work through, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think we typically, you know, it's that dignity of experience and being able to have the opportunity to experience things. You know, far too often we see things maybe in schools where people say, hey, you're really good at stocking shelves. That's what you're going to do for your job. That's where I'm going to get you your job. And we don't see that type of approach. We want to work with people, give them experience and education and everything else that they might need to make a good decision and try things and maybe fail and that be okay. And realize what they like and what they don't like, because you know, you're going to be more apt to stay in a job and do the things that you want to do if you like the job. So we really kind of come from that, you know, and that's why I think a SIL and that kind of thinking is very powerful when you start to get into this, you know, thinking around employment.
Absolutely.
All right. And what about your program in getting started and operating? What barriers have you encountered and I trust have overcome?
Do we have another hour to talk about that, Richard?
You know, 2 minutes. Give us a highlight.
It's a great question, and I think you know, we have worked with SILs now at this point across the country on developing similar programming, and we see a lot of trends. I think the biggest challenge is finding a funder that agrees and supports your philosophy. And I think that's really important, especially when we're talking about working within the independent living movement. Having a funder who is going to accept that person-centered approach, as in contrast to the traditional, you know, medical model, so to speak, to accept that, to allow you to give the person a voice and not just evaluate a person and as Seth said, you know, determine what job they're best for it, because that really doesn't ever work. So it's finding a funder and you know, really supports that agree with what you're trying to do, and that makes the hugest difference. But then, you know, we have all the barriers here for our programming that we see across the country. Lehigh Valley is part urban, part suburban, part rural, so we have transportation barriers for folks to get access services. We also see a lot of, I think, barriers that are more systemic. Yeah, you know, we have some diverse population here in the Lehigh Valley, and maybe you're going to ask us this later, Richard. So I don't want to steal your thunder. Is that question coming up?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, then I'll hold off on that. But just, you know, more systemic things that you know, can impede somebody's opportunity to access services, I think is another huge barrier.
Yeah, and there's some of the old ones, transportation, waiting lists, you know, all of those kind of things that, you know, through funders that can be very difficult, you know, rural areas, being culturally competent, you know, making sure that you're taking everybody into consideration, you know, all those kind of things being very important.
Excellent, and thank you. Your programs are self-sustaining. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And how has that worked, marrying employment with SIL services? Because SIL services have been in many cases in the past, especially before the transition was added as a core service. How long did it take you to get successful, and what path did you take to make those programs successful?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. And you know, I think we started off initially with that group dynamic of that summer program of that S2L group, and we learned so much from that. from that group dynamic, and what can be taken from people learning from each other, and that whole power of positive peer pressure, we call it, where someone, hey, I just got a job. Well, that sounds great. I might want to look into that too. So that was so beneficial going into things. And then getting into the employment piece with our local, we really had a great relationship with our local VR office that really helped us get things off the ground. And we really saw the need to take things almost to a more professional level when it came to job coaching, based on some of the stuff that we have seen and experienced. But I mean, we saw it as, especially the employment as an absolutely perfect fit to a still, because it can be almost totally wrapped around a person. If someone comes to us for help with a job, well, you know what? You start to make a little bit of money, you want to spend that money. How do I balance my checkbook? How do I get a bank account? I'm really interested in a social opportunity. Well, maybe come and check out some of our social groups, make some friends, and do some stuff around that. Maybe you get to the point where you eventually realize, well, I'd really like to look for an apartment or something like that. Well, we could help with that too. And it just fit so well on so many levels.
Yeah, we found that this is Joe, designing our programs with the core services embedded in them. Like we do our core services, but then if we're working on employment, which might be funded by Voc Rehab, we're doing it with IL skills and information and referral and peer support and self and advocacy skills. Like all of that stuff is embedded in everything we do. So it actually makes for more holistic programming, as Seth said, that can really help somebody kind of tackle all of those areas of life that affect employment and vice versa.
Well, and this is Seth again too, and it really touches into the core services too, because, as a core service staff person, they're pretty much community experts. They know what's out there. They know where people, different things different programs, different opportunities that a person can tap into. So, we always see our relationships with different agencies and other programs as being so beneficial, because you never know what someone needs or wants. And it's about that consumer. It's about getting them to where they want to be, giving them the information, the education, the support, and no matter what that is.
All right, and if you will, scan down and see if there have been any audience questions you'd like to pick one. We're getting close to the end here, and if you don't find one that looks interesting to you, I have one that we can close with.
Unfortunately, Richard, we don't have any questions. So if folks are out there, and they want to...
Oh, actually, this is Megan Henley at UNH. I have a couple of questions that I've noted have come in that you might want to field.
Okay.
One question, do you get chances often to connect with other independent living centers? It seems like great information that could be shared across centers. And also, where can we learn more about person-centered planning versus approach? So those were the two questions that you all might want to pop in on.
I can help with that first one, if I may. We have been fortunate to be able to work with Joe and Seth and the Lehigh Valley SIL team, LVCIL, in doing several trainings, both on location and by the web. And that's for other centers. And then we have the Second Learning Collaborative that we're now operating, and we've had 12 other centers that have learned and developed programs, as will an additional 12. I should say most of those programs developed, and we expect most of the programs that are working with Joe and Seth in their leadership role there will do that too. And let's see, it's 11:48. Maybe I could also ask Joe and Seth, if you were going to give the first beginning, if someone said in another center, what would be the first step and the best way to begin getting programs like these going in their centers?
I would say breathe. Breathing is important. No, but I think Seth would agree with me. We always say to take it slow. It's really finding a funder, a program structure, something you can do that you can do really well, and then build off of that.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. This is Seth again too. What is the need? Talk to people, find out what the need in that community is, and see where a program can be built around that, and then just keep plugging. And that's really what did it for us. We hit the ground, talked to everybody we could, and it has helped us build and build and build. But we recommend starting slow and doing it the right way.
And that's good. Find the need in your community and find the pain points for the other organizations that are working for people with disabilities, and help them address those. And I would also like to say the ILRU website, ilru.org. You can go there for on-demand trainings on this topic and for announcements of future activities. For Centers for Independent Living, a great opportunity to connect with other centers who have that same interest. And if I'm correct on our timing, John, is that correct? I think that we're at our time point.
We have a few more minutes. We have a few more.
Well, excellent.
This
That's
is
great.
Can I jump in and say two things? One, if you're not connected to your SIL, so back up one step. If you're not connected to your SIL in your community, how do you find your SIL?
Thank you for asking. ILRU has a directory of centers.
I figured. Good.
Listed on the main page of the ilru.org website. Go down to directory, and you'll see a directory by state, and they're listed there for every state in the country, and it's maintained to be as absolutely updated as we can possibly make it. We depend upon centers to keep us updated, and if we do find a center that's not updated, we're assertive about going out and reaching out to them and making sure that they've given us the latest information.
And then my other question is, how do you recommend, as we reported on both, a couple of things I talked about earlier, different states are doing pre-ETs very differently. Right. In some state, leave it at that. How do you build a relationship, if you don't already have one, with your VR department? Those relationships are very different. And VR is, funding different things in pre-ETs and in other things. If you don't have that relationship right now, how do you start to build it?
Joe and Seth, this one is coming right at you.
Yeah, so I'll just say, we are very aware of that, and especially across the country, in certain parts of the country, there's quite a history between SILs and VRs and other agencies in VRs that can be, in the past, was maybe combative, so to speak. But I just want to offer that Seth and I would be available to talk to anybody who's kind of dealing with that. It's an extensive conversation. It's not something we can answer in this few seconds here on the webinar, but there are a lot of different approaches to working with your Voc Rehab to establish that relationship, and we could talk a lot about that.
Yeah, this is Seth. We were very fortunate to have our executive director be very tight with the local office executive director of our local office, and from there it kind of bloomed. So we were very fortunate to the point now where we have a similar relationship with our local office too.
Yeah. And then building it up to the state level and offering, we've even with our local OVR office have talked to other SILs and other VR offices about how to create that relationship. And then I think there was a question about person-centered planning too. Just real quick, you can find information about that on the ILRU website, or also feel free to contact us. We would be happy we'll talk about this stuff all day.
We love talking about this stuff, right?
Well, do talk a little bit more about how you deal with person-centered planning in a consumer-directed environment.
Yeah, also a big question, but a good question, a really good question. For us, it's all comes down to that consumer control. You know, in today's day and age, so many people use that phrase, person-centered, right? We see it from the medical field. They talk about patient-centered. Schools talk about student-centered. So when we say person-centered, it kind of falls into that same bag, but it really is a different thing. Person-centered planning isn't just being focused on an individual and their wants and needs. Person-centered is about what comes out of the individual. It's their goals, their desires, and then our job is to make the system work for them and for their goals that they want to pursue. And I think, you know, it's similar to a person-centered approach, but when you do a more formal model, you're actually going through a process where you're doing discovery and you're creating more formal documents and forms
and goals and action steps based on exactly what that young adult or what that person wants, and having the team help that person reach those goals. It's a living, breathing document. You come out with a living, breathing document that can change as the person changes, as their goals and wants and wishes change. It kind of follows them. An incredible process. We've heard that for some people in transition, it was the most significant thing that they've done as part for their family.
That's exciting to hear, and appreciate that. And you know, John has given us a little bit more time, and this is good, because I was afraid I might not get to ask you this. You have been doing this work for some time. What trends are you seeing? Good and not good, but trends that you're seeing in terms of youth employment preparation and youth employment?
I was just going to say, Richard, the first trend is that Seth and I are a lot older and a lot less hair. That's the first trend.
That's a trend.
Yeah. But I think, you know, there's a lot that needs to be done. There's a lot of tweaking from every state that does this all differently to come up with best practices for pre-employment transition services and all these things. But all that said, there are more opportunities today for young adults to have a better and more successful transition than there's been since I've been in this field for 20 some years, and Seth would say the same.
Yeah, and you're starting to see more unique and creative things come up. You know, programs embedded, like employment programs embedded in businesses or embedded in colleges, or more opportunities for young adults with disabilities to attend post-secondary options. You know, so you're starting to see more of that kind of thing.
All right.
This is John. I had another question for you guys. I noted that you had used DD Council, Developmental Disability Council funding to sort of seed some of your programs. If you could comment on that briefly, we're getting close to the end, but.
Yeah, that the Developmental Disabilities Council. Every state has a DDC council, and you could probably Google that to find out more information. But they typically are looking at changing the system in one way or another through a variety of options and opportunities through funding sources. So we've gotten numerous grants over the years, and that's kind of pretty much how we started. We got this grant from the DDC to be able to, you know, start our young adult group, our S2L group, and our Real World Lehigh Valley. So, like you said, that kind of gave us the backing to really learn, take our time to get things all where it needed to be, and from there, it really helped to grow things.
Yeah, and this is Joe. I just had the DDC also helped us start our college-based program, our SEED program at our local community college. And at one time, we got an innovation and expansion grant through VR that helped us start our initial employment services here at the SIL. But now we're at the point where really, if we, you know, when pre-ETS stuff started, the pre-employment transition services, we didn't need a grant to start it up. We just built it off of our infrastructure that we already had. So it's you know, scaling it up slowly until you get to the point where you can sustain adding more programming without maybe initial funds.
And this is Seth again, and we've been so fortunate to have a very good grant writer that knew the approach to, you know, the DDC or these innovation and expansion grants and that type of thing. And then also, you know, fiscal folks that have been really able to help us, you know, translate dollars into program costs. You know, so, you know, it's really been a team effort for making things happen.
And John, as we conclude, we come back to the question from the audience about connecting to other centers, it's important that centers know that Joe and Seth are available as consultants, and we at ILRU have used them, and they're superb. And other centers, not other centers, but centers, I'm sure would value connecting with them and would gain much from doing so. So
Thank you, Richard.
that's certainly an option.
Thank you, Richard.
Okay.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Well, to the end. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.